William Harrison's preparatory school for gifted youngsters was a big school. A very big school. A very, very big and ginormous school. Yeah, that sounds better. If I had to compare it to anything, it would probably be Hogwarts. If Hogwarts, of course, were located in America and funded not by goblins, but by the social elites who sold their soul to the devil. That place really was the love child of Gothic and neoclassical architecture. Its 4 towers, like those of a mosque, reaching far up to the sky and looming over it. The only other thing I suppose you could look at and get the same vibe would be a tsunami. Excluding the main building, which had all the things you'd expect from a school, cafeteria, gymnasium, classroom, etc., you also had several dormitories nearby, which were basically low-key high-rise apartment complexes. Besides those, there were also several full-size stadiums for various sports, which, as far as I'm concerned, were more suited for pro athletes than a bunch of lazy high school kids. Don't even get me started on the horse stables. With all that in mind, I'm sure you get the idea of just how big this place was. And one day, during my first senior year, as I was eating my lunch alone as always, I remember wondering out loud, without having swallowed my sandwich, mind you, "Man, who cleans this place?" I'd already been a student here for about 2 years, and I'd seen some stuff that really should have decommissioned the place for good, ranging from health hazards, death, and property damage that should have only really been caused by dynamite. But I can assure you that whatever the hell destroyed the school's observatory sure wasn't dynamite. And yet, the very next day after any incident, at most 2 for the really severe ones, like the observatory, students would be allowed to come back to school, and everything would be just like it had been before. Everything from the students who died to the buildings that had been damn near evaporated would be back as if nothing had ever happened. Not to mention messes that would have given body cleaning experts nausea would be taken care of, easy peasy. I asked one of the teachers who was in charge of maintaining the school, assuming that the principal just, had a lot of contracts with cleaners and contractors. But that teacher, as well as every other person I asked, said there was only a single individual who kept the school, the whole school clean, and in tip-top shape. Mr. Enoch. Now, obviously, I thought they were messing with me because there was no way any one man could clean a place as massive as William Harrison Preparatory School for gifted youngsters, consistently and, most of all, regularly. But the more I thought about it, the less crazy it seemed. With all the other things I'd seen over the years, could one guy cleaning a really damn big place really be that far-fetched? After ghosts, demons, dimensional travel, serial killers, that one succubus, and everything else, would one guy cleaning a big place really be where I'd draw the line? It was around March 24th, to be exact. To say that I had nothing better to do on that unassuming Wednesday would be an understatement. With the map Mrs. Scott had given me back during sophomore year, I had no trouble finding the janitor's closet. But I did frown when I saw that it was located at the very edge of the map. At the very edge of the school grounds, in fact. When lunch rolled around, I followed the map, making my way through the eerily empty grounds, until the small dot on the map that represented me reached the spot labeled Janitor's Closet. I looked around, but saw nothing. Even when gazing at the furthest end of the threshold of the wood from my left to my right, my scar that I got during junior year from those damn elves aching as I did so, I saw nothing. The map showed that I was right above the janitor's closet, and I don't know if it was intuition or experience, maybe both, but I looked down and stared real hard at the grass. That's when I noticed it. A hatch. A metallic, rusty, grass-covered hatch. My next period after lunch was a free one, so I think you, dear reader, will have no trouble guessing what I did next. Part of me felt relieved that it was far away from the main building, as the moan that the thing let out as I lifted it open could have burst eardrums unless you were out of sight. The other part of me, the small, rational, sane part that had somehow survived after so long and after everything, protested vehemently, but I still went down there anyway. My phone's flashlight revealed a long, winding stairway that traveled deep below the earth, so deeply, in fact, that a dark fog that my light couldn't quite vanish hid the end. The derelict stairway creaked every time I shifted my weight a step further down, the sound amplified by the stagnant silence that hung everywhere in the air around me. I had no idea what to expect. At one point, I checked my map and saw that the layout had changed. The stained maroon interior had become a cool charcoal gray, but instead of showing the outline of my school and all the other buildings, it showed me long and winding tunnels. Think of a subway map, covered by spilled noodles. That, in effect, was what I was seeing. I continued on, and the stairway eventually devolved into a ladder. Upon reaching the bottom, I was greeted by 6 lonely tunnels, each holding aloft signs written in a language that could never come naturally to any human. Devil runes, as I had unfortunately come to learn from Isaac's writing. Squinting at my map, I was barely able to make out my destination, but once I found Janitor's room, a faint path illuminated. I followed it through one of the tunnels and made my way through the unwinding path, one infinitely more perplexed than any sewer system, a system that could have very easily belonged to Hayr, that underground part of the school dormitories which inspired Lovecraftian cities of Rylea. After a while, through good or bad luck, either as likely culpable as the other, I happened upon the door I'd been looking for all along. It looked so out of place that it actually fit. Plastered on that stained and weathered accented concrete was a quaint and antiquated wooden door, baby blue when it came to color, and decidedly Victorian when it came to style. I could have done any number of things at that moment, but there was only one which came to mind and seemed appropriate given the circumstances. I knocked 3 times, waiting for the door to open. I heard a latch being unlocked, and the man I'd been searching for all this time peered out. "Hello?" A raspy voice, almost throwing up dust, spoke out, and I was somewhat taken aback by the figure who soon revealed itself to me. A tall, lanky, fairly disheveled old man stood beyond the threshold of the door and looked at me without a shred of animosity or annoyance. His eyes were weathered but kind, and the small badge that hung from his uniform read Mr. Enoch. Of the two of us, I'm sure he was warier of me than I was of him, but even so, the old janitor didn't hesitate for a moment in letting me in, after expressing my desire to enter. His room was, for lack of a better description, a windowless jail cell. The cellar reached high up, like we were at the bottom of a fat well, and although spacious, I was also greeted by a bed, a table, a sofa, and countless books written by none other than Professor Francis himself. A single chair had been set up in front of the sofa, as though he'd been expecting me. The old man wobbled towards the sofa, and I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. He looked like he'd have a hard time holding a mop, let alone using it, and even more so to clean a place like William Harrison Preparatory School for Gifted Youngsters. After we'd seated ourselves, an uncomfortable silence took hold. I had no idea where to start, and Mr. Enoch seemed to be going through the very same problem. I myself became so focused on finding something to talk about that I was caught off guard when he said something. Are there any more trees left beyond the ones here?" I stared at him, confused by what he was trying to get out of me. Thankfully, he understood my confusion and elaborated further, When I was younger, I read a science fiction story about how in the far future there would be no more trees, only concrete and metal. I haven't been out for a while, so has that happened yet? No, I told him bluntly, at least not yet. His mild grimace softened into a smile at my wit. After that, Mr. Enoch mostly asked questions about the outside world, and we had a nice chat. I feel somewhat guilty for not being able to precisely recall what it was that we talked about at the time, since I'm writing this now. I do remember, however, that after some time had passed, Mr. Enoch suddenly lifted his sleeve and stared at his vintage wristwatch that clung to his waning wrist. I apologize, but I'm afraid we have to cut our conversation short, he said quite suddenly. I looked at the time on my phone and saw that the school day was almost over. Mr. Enoch was nice enough to show me out, and for once, I wish I could have stayed longer at school. Talking to Mr. Enoch became a daily routine. I like to think that it was therapeutic for both of us. In our subsequent interactions, I'd mostly asked him about his past. From what he told me, Mr. Enoch had been the janitor for the school since the mid-1930s, and he'd gotten the job to support his family during the Great Depression. The money he earned was the only thing that kept them afloat. Even after the Depression passed, he continued to work at the school as a janitor, eventually moving in to live here. It was the only thing he was qualified to do, and the cash was better than almost any other job that he had had. He had seen strange things, he told me, much like I had, and there were other janitors who'd help him out, but after so long, he was the only one who'd stayed. Made it, was how he put it, and I couldn't help but understand. Anyway, as he got older, he found it increasingly difficult to do his job. It also certainly didn't help that he had to do everything alone by this point. He felt like Sisyphus, he told me, each day struggling and pushing against a boulder that put him at the threshold of his strength limits, only for it to roll back down again. When the 2008 economic crisis hit, he knew he'd be offed. For the first time, there were many people willing to take his job, and that, coupled with him losing his house, made him terrified of ending up on the street and in a world that he hadn't been in for decades. In short, he was willing to do anything to keep his position. Anything? The principal asked. Anything, I replied, and thanked him, and now I have this job forever. He wouldn't elaborate any further on that. By the end of April, I'd told him all about the things I'd experienced, and he seemed saddened by what he called the 1,000-yard ramble, where I'd explained everything in great detail, but gave the impression I wasn't talking to anyone in particular, like talking to a wall. Never made much sense to me back then, but I went along with it. Interesting, isn't it? Mr. Enoch once told me after finishing a long sip of tea. You'd think you'd have this whole place figured out by now. After all, that's what you've gone through, but there's still so much more, ain't there? You'll be gone soon enough, and the next fresh fish, one with a heart like yours, will still be able to see this much and much and much more. That honestly scares me more than anything. If everything I've gone through is just a drop in the bucket, then I don't ever want to think about the ocean floor and what it could possibly hold. These were the kinds of conversations we had. They really lifted a weight off my shoulders, you know? Made me feel like a human and made me feel understood. Corny, I know, but what the hell, am I right? On some occasions, though, I'd find his presence unbearable. I saw myself in him. I saw where I never left this place. But then I'd wonder if it would be so bad. Scouts, Wendy's, Derek's, and others like me would always continue to come here, and with my experience, maybe I could save them. But Mr. Enoch's gaze would always curdle whatever I'd be thinking like that at the time, as if he knew what my mind was toiling at, before telling me not to think too much, for fear would rot my brain. Too much thinking is bad, he always tells me, And maybe there's a benefit to being ignorant to it all. Maybe if I'd been ignorant, the past would never haunt me. I think it was around late April when I decided to die. I didn't know how, just that it would happen before graduation. Something would come my way, and I wouldn't run like a coward. That's all I knew. The next few days were all a haze. Exams were on the horizon, but what the hell did I care? The days started to compress together like pancakes, each day blurring into the next. Things had been peaceful. My mind didn't really like peaceful. As far as my mind was concerned, something was wrong. In essence, I found myself trapped in the coils of a reality that I wanted to desperately escape from. I wasn't going to attempt to take my life. I was merely waiting for it to end. Just like that, all the other things in life came to me when I least expected. On one day in particular, May the 9th, on Thursday, when my mom would be working until early the next morning, and I was supposed to return by bus, I dozed off after my last class, and by the time I woke up, only moonlight shone through the windows. This wasn't the first time I'd been in the place after dark, far from it, but this was the first time that I was here past midnight. The monolithic saying inscribed last in Adam's Last Testament I'd found with Mrs. Scott that time in junior year reverberated in my skull as though I was just reading it for the first time all over again. Abandon hope, all ye who last past midnight. And I felt that this was it. It would be waiting outside the classroom. The thing that would finally give me the peace I wanted. The peace that I deserved. The light of the moon oozed through the sealed window, stretching my shadow thin like the sun. My mind was counting every second, my ears ignorant to each step I took, even though I myself was not aware of it. I walked down the long, ever-winding, ever-changing hallways, led not by Mrs. Scout's map, but by my shadow, the bowsprit that led me forward. Eventually, my shadow clashed against the shadows of something else, two ships colliding with each other. I'd finally met them, the one who I knew would give me the peace I wanted. I looked up, 30 seconds till midnight. What are you doing here? I admit that despite him being that old, hearing Mr. Enoch's voice tremble as much as it did was something that caught me off guard. You're always alone, I'd told him. 22 seconds till midnight. Even now I can feel them, like a metronome bashing the inside of my skull. It's a terrible feeling. Believe me, others have always come to my aid, but it's about time I return the favor. 12 seconds till midnight. No, was all my friend could say before he collapsed to the ground. 10 seconds till midnight. Mr. Enoch writhed as though he was the rope in a tug-of-war between a seizure and an orgasm. You don't understand. It's not too late. Get out of here. I can't hold it. These and many others are the words I thought Mr. Enoch would have told me, were he not in the middle of his midnight metamorphosis, the one I'd sensed. With every tick, his bones cracked, his flesh seared and squirmed, his mind fragmented. But not once between any of them did he let out a scream. Midnight finally fell like a curtain. One last tick, and it came. Hundreds of leeches seemed to erupt out of the poor old janitor, each the size of a horsefly, gushing forth towards me like a Yellowstone geyser. 40 yards became 30, 30 became 20, 20 became 10. The wave approached like a slithering snake, and one could outrun it if they were fast enough, and if they started running before the thing picked up steam. But I stood still. It was only when the wave was about to cross the 5-yard threshold that someone tugged my arm with unprecedented strength. I found myself running, the avalanche behind me picking up pace like a snowball, rolling down from Everest's summit. Mrs. Scout? I wasn't being pulled. Rather, I was chasing the past. I could hear her steps, muffled as they were by the ear-caressing squelching sound that followed me. I lost track of her, but when I noticed a wave of ashen hair disappear behind a corner, I followed it. Desperately, I wanted to catch up with Wendy, to apologize. The more I ran, the more I felt like I was chasing darkness, something that I'd always carried in my shadow, but never been able to reach. I found myself surrounded by lockers. The wave was approaching from both sides, and I knew that it wanted to sink its countless vile teeth into me and leave nothing behind. I closed my eyes and felt the strongest grip yet yank me to my feet and shove me into a locker. The door slammed, and through the cracks, I saw Derek, his face contorted into one of rigid grimness. "We're fine with being stuck here," he said, "but not with you joining us." He ran in the direction I had, and a large looming shadow left me in darkness. The countless, ever-sprawling maggots didn't dare invade the privacy of the locker. They seemed to shriek like a crowd jeering because I had gotten away. It was so dark, I only remember waking up. Mr. Enoch had opened the locker and held me tightly, glad to see I was alive. "You see that?" he said, barely able to contain the first genuine emotion he'd felt in a long time. "You're not alone, and you never will be. Not here, not outside either." I took a bus home in awe and shock. The whole ride, I just tried my best to focus my attention on the blooming sunrise. I found my mother asleep. She'd collapsed on the couch the moment she'd returned, which, I guess, worked in my favor. Not that long has passed since then. Story's over. I get it's odd, especially after my last one. First comes the beginning, then I give you an end of sorts. This isn't like me. I bet you'd be disappointed with the pessimistic tone I've written this in. You don't know anything, though, do you? So many things I haven't elaborated on. Hell, things I haven't even mentioned yet, but which I will, in time. The lid of Pandora's box has been opened. Thanks to you, Mr. Enoch. I'll tell someone else's story next time. Those who were consumed before they had a chance to do so themselves. God knows that's the only reason I'm still alive and kicking anyway. All thanks to you. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.